Nathan designed a new Carter Center project to mitigate political and identity-based violence in the United States back in the summer of 2020. And through his work, he's building diverse networks of citizens from across the political spectrum to serve as community advocates for electoral democracy and the peaceful resolution of disputes. We need a lot more of that for sure. Nathan has an MA in International Peace and Conflict from the American University in Washington, D.C., and he also has a BA in International Relations from Colgate University. Well, his topic today is indeed a very timely one. Why we are polarized and what the research shows. So let's give a warm welcome to our fellow member, Nathan.
Thanks, Bryce. It's good to see everyone this morning. So as Bryce alluded to, I work with the Carter Center when I'm not chasing my kids around. That's my day job. And for over 3 years, I have been leading a new project that I designed to address political divisions in the United States, particularly polarization to the extent that it bleeds into violence, which we've seen increasingly in our body politic since 2016. So today, I'm going to share a presentation that I developed for these civic network members. So my day job is building bipartisan networks of citizens in states that are at higher risk of violence around elections or otherwise. So my project is working in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. Officially, I am not working in Minnesota, but I'm still happy to be with all of you this morning. So what you're about to see is a primer that I share with folks that we bring into these networks. We're recruiting people in these states to say, hey, do you want to come together with your fellow Americans? Do you want to try to solve these problems? Do you want to create a landing place, a kind of platform for Americans who are concerned about our divisions and want to do something about it? In order to prep our fellow citizens for that work, I have found that it is useful to explain how we got into this mess. This is part one. If Bryce and company will have me back, there could be a part two. Okay, part one is how we got into this mess. Why are we so divided? Part two, at some future date, will explore a whole bunch of different tools and ways of thinking about how to get out of this, right? But first, for this morning, a summary of how we became so divided. So the first thing I want to share here is a slide from Pew. Pew has been asking Americans a battery of questions about our policy preferences and political views since I started college in 1994. This chart plots responses to those questions against various demographic characteristics. So education level, religious attendance, gender, ethnicity. And what is so useful about this graphic is that it demonstrates that as recently as 1994, which I would swear wasn't that long ago, partisan affiliation, the line at the top is party affiliation, was almost no more predictive of Americans' political views than people's race, or whether or not they were religious, or male or female, right? What this chart is showing is how between 1994 and 2017, party identity became this overarching identity that subsumed many other things, right? So how did this happen? Well, I'm going to argue to you this morning that there are two ways of thinking about this. What I call structural drivers of polarization, and then we'll talk about behavioral drivers. So the structural drivers are changes in American life, things much bigger than any of us in this room. Changes in our technology, changes in our media, changes in the way our economy works, changes in demographics. There are a whole host of factors that have come together in America certainly by 2016, 2017, 2024, to create conditions conducive to polarization. What are these? Well, I would list the big ones as follows. This is drawn on an increasing boatload of social science research, right? Political scientists, everybody's looking into this. The things that jump out to me from a review of this literature are, number one, changing demographics. So this is using the language of the US Census Bureau, right? The census is conducted every 10 years. And one of the things we look at every 10 years is the percentage of the population that wasn't born in the United States, the foreign-born population. And just using 2018 as a benchmark, what you can see, and this is just obvious if you live in America, right, is that the percentage of people in America today who weren't born here is higher than at any point in about 100 years. That matters because there's a boatload of research that suggests that immigration, even the fear of hypothetical immigration in places where immigration is very low, like Hungary, has been unsettling to most democracies around the world, right? Our democracy is not the only one that's having a rocky time, right? Most democracies around the world are dealing with some degree of a conservative, authoritarian backlash. And if you want to sort through all the factors that have, again, created conditions for this problem, changing demographics, immigration, fear of immigration, would be somewhere near the top of the list. I'm not saying it's number one, but it's up there. Second, you have to talk about changes in the media landscape. In particular, in our country, the fact today that Americans increasingly are not communicating to one another from a shared basis of facts. Why is that? Well, because, especially now, but really this goes back to the 80s, it has been possible to curate your own media consumption in such a way as to hear very, very different versions of the case, of what's going on, what are our problems, what are the causes of our problems. Social media is obviously a factor here. Algorithms serve up more of what you click on, right? But really, there's a lot of research that suggests that actually in the US case, the rise of talk radio in the 80s, cable news, and then more partisan cable news, that may be at least as big a factor in this. Rising income inequality and the way that relates to perception. So one of the resources I cite here is Yascha Monk's book. That's footnoted here. By the way, I can share these slides with Bryce. The slides have footnotes. You can think of these slides as an annotated bibliography. If you want to read more about the forces pulling us apart, follow these slides, follow the footnotes, read great books. One of them cited here is Yascha Monk's The People versus Democracy. One of the great stats he has in there is that from 1935 to 1960, the income of the typical American household doubled, and it doubled again from 60 to 85, okay? That's my grandpa's generation, right? My grandfather was a welder, of course, never went to college. When he got married to my grandma, they lived in a room in a boarding house. By the time he retired, in the mid-1980s, he owned a house, couple of acres, small business doing construction, had an RV and a cottage in Florida. In the 20th century, for my grandfather, democracy delivered in spades, right? His material well-being radically improved over the course of his lifetime. I don't think I need to tell you, our economy has not worked that way for most Americans for a very long time. Why does that matter in this story? Well, I mean, here you can bring in to bear the whole political science research on revolutions. Why do revolutions start? Why was there a revolution in Russia in 1917 or Iran in 1979? To summarize, it's not just poverty or anger that brings about a revolution. It is the combination of those things with the perception that you shouldn't be screwed, right? And that is one of the factors alive in America today. I grew up in a 1 square mile town, an hour from Buffalo, never recovered from the closure of Bethlehem Steel in Buffalo circa 1984. I remember the closure of Bethlehem Steel, watching it on TV news when I was like 8, and I didn't know anyone who worked there because it was so devastating, right? So I went to high school with people who could see that they will never achieve the standard of living of their parents and their grandparents. That's very tangible. And it breeds the kind of resentment that correlates to political violence. Okay, declining trust in institutions. Maybe this is obvious, but Gallup surveys Americans. They ask us questions. They've been asking us questions since Nixon was in the White House. What do you trust? Banks, big business, TV news, church and organized religion, the military, the courts. Trust on all of those institutions of American life has more or less been declining since Nixon was in the White House. Why does that matter to this story? Well, because if you don't trust any of these mediating institutions, if no one knows what they're doing or can tell you the straight story, that is another factor pushing us back into closed media ecosystems and tribal corners. Finally, Bill Bishop's book, also highlighted here, The Big Sort. This book, is 20 years old now, but it tracks how Americans, going back to the late 70s, have been moving to live in politically homogeneous communities, right? Or congregating at churches that are politically homogeneous, right? Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem in the sense that many Americans today, most, if you look at the numbers, are less likely to go to church with, or work with, or bump into at their kids' Little League game somebody who votes differently from them. That in turn breeds misunderstanding, stereotyping, the assumption that people who vote for the other side are terrifying space aliens, right? Okay, so I'm gonna sort of speed through this material so that we have a little bit of time for discussion at the end. And if you're an American, you are very entitled to an opinion on all this. You could add to this list for sure, but we'll talk more about that at the end. So these are the ones that I see as big. But there's another side to this story. And this is in some ways the new frontier of political scientists, right? Looking at how our brains are wired and the ways in which, on top of all of these structural factors and changes in American life, it increasingly appears to be the case that we're set up at a deep neurological level to polarize. So the first thing I would keep in mind here, this is a quote from Jonathan Haidt's excellent book, highly recommended. We're not rational. This is a bipartisan issue. Liberals, conservatives, none of us are as rational as we would like to think we are. Not only are we not rational, but we are designed, in Haidt's words, for groupish righteousness. We're designed to affiliate with groups and to believe that our groups are the best. Key thing to keep in mind. Within all this, three things jump out to me. And again, we could spend a whole day talking about this. And to be clear, I am neither a neurologist nor a political psychologist. I'm just mining the research and my own experience in this work. But three things jump out to me as being particularly salient here. The first is this idea that, from an evolutionary standpoint, belonging to our groups is much more important than the facts of a case. Imagine, we are hunting and gathering in bands of 30. Our main goal is to not get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. In that context, your relationship with those 30 other people is very important. It is of paramount importance to your survival that you believe in, trust, and get along with the other 30 of us with, stone-tipped spears, right? We evolved to think this way and to affiliate into groups in this way. Much more important than arbitrary facts that may or may not impinge on our lives. That's a big one. The other, and I'm gonna kind of speed through this in the interest of time, but this is summarizing a lot of Jonathan Haidt's work, and it's super interesting. This book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, is excellent. So the short version is this guy Haidt set out to study how do we make decisions about what's right and wrong? And why, seemingly, do people reach conflicting decisions about that? Why do we not have universal agreement on right and wrong? Where do these ideas come from? He comes up with this 5-part framework. He argues that all human beings across cultures make decisions about morality across a series of continua, right? Care versus harm. Is someone being cared for or harmed? Fairness on one end of the spectrum versus cheating. loyalty to your group versus betrayal, deference to authority versus subverting authority, and then sanctity degradation. These get into questions of purity, cleanliness, right? Think about all the complex religious systems that humans have developed that get into these questions. Hinduism, whole bunch of rules about cleanliness, like Orthodox Judaism, right? Please come on in, have a seat. So he argues that all humans across cultures, and he studies target populations in Philadelphia, somewhere in India, and somewhere in Brazil. And he walks them through these hypothetical cases, describing a thing that may or may not be moral and asks them to evaluate it. And what he found across these target populations is that yuppies, for lack of a better term, the highly educated, upwardly mobile types in India and Philadelphia and Brazil tended to make decisions about right or wrong based on a more narrow constellation of these factors. They were particularly focused on care versus harm. Is someone being hurt by the action? And on these questions of fairness. Is it equitable? People who skewed more conservative across target countries tended to look more fully at all 5 of these domains. To be focused on care and harm, or someone getting hurt, but also to place more of a priority on loyalty to one's group, questions of cleanliness or purity, right? And this is one of those things when I read this book, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I totally get it, right? And as you absorb more of this research, I mean, you see this all the time in your social interactions, the way people can just have seemingly very different reactions to the same set of stimuli. And you can imagine how this, if this is true, has impacts on our politics and who we vote for. So the last set of things I want to talk about here are sort of neural disposition. So this is from a book that's now 10 years old. These 3 political scientists argue that some combination of our genetics, early childhood experiences, they create what they call preset response tendencies to stimuli. Now these are guys who do things like look at identical twins. This is a thing, right? Twins separated at birth, it happens, right? They track a set of identical twins who are genetically identical, and it just so happens that one of them was raised by hippies, and one of them was raised by very conservative religious fundamentalists. And what they find is that time and again, both people end up with more or less the same politics. Either they both skew liberal or they both skew conservative, even if they were raised in very different households. This is just some of the research they draw on. And ultimately, they're careful not to say, they're not saying we're born with our politics. They're not saying it's all genetics. But they do argue that we end up in a place where people seemingly, at a very deep subconscious level, respond to the world around them in different ways. So for example, they note that folks who skew more conservative have higher threat responses. Folks who skew more liberal are animated and just energized by variety of experiences, newness, right? And again, this is the kind of thing you read a book like this and you can't stop seeing it. I'll give you a couple examples. Years ago, I worked in Afghanistan for a couple of years. And in those days, in Afghanistan, there were a handful of bars catering to foreigners like me who worked in Afghanistan. There was a particular place that you could go to get a Heineken and the worst taco you've ever had. Just horrible tacos. But, options were limited, so I would go to this bar to eat a crappy taco and drink a Heineken. And in order to exit the bar or to enter, you would go through what's called an airlock security checkpoint. Essentially, there were 2 doors. It's like a door to the perimeter, there's a space in between, and then there's another gate and wall around the outside because, it's Afghanistan in 2005. It might be a target of the Taliban. There's an insurgency going on, and right? So you had these 2 gates, you had security, and in that space in between the 2 gates, there was a weapons locker. Because a lot of the guys who would come to the bar were like U.S. private security contractors. They would come armed, and beer and firearms, not an awesome combination. So you had to check your sidearm to get into the bar. So I'm coming out of the bar, having had my crappy taco, and I'm in this sort of airlock space in between with this other guy who's obviously a fellow American. He's recovering his sidearm from the weapons locker. He kind of looks at me, and I'm like, hey. He's like, so you're not carrying? I said, no, I work for this nonprofit, and like the security situation in Kabul at that time, as opposed to other parts of Afghanistan, wasn't too bad. I was like, I don't think I need to. I think it's fine. This guy looked at me like I had 6 heads. He said to me, he said, if you go out that door without a firearm, you are taking your life in your own hands. And in that moment, I remember thinking, like, something's going on here. Because this guy and he's trying to do me a solid. He's concerned about my well-being and is trying to help me out. Beyond that, presumably we're responding to the same data. We both live in Kabul. We both recognize it's a war zone. It's not like he's totally wrong. There's no black and white answer to it. But we felt, at a deep level, we felt differently about it, right? The other day, I was in Miami for work with some very conservative Floridians that I've recruited for this project where we bring people together. We work in Florida. I've recruited Republicans and Democrats. One of my colleagues is from Miami, Cuban-American, Miami, all the way. She took us to this huge Cuban restaurant, and I'd never been to like a legit Cuban restaurant before. I don't know anything about Cuban cuisine. The menu was the thickness of the King James Bible. All the Cuban food you could ever have, and I have a real life Cuban-American right there to tell me what to get. And I was like, awesome. Anything, like, I want it all. Like, I'll eat anything, just let's do it. She's like, oh, we'll try this chicken thing, and then I'm like, yes. I had this other colleague with me named Kurt. He's a white dude, son of a farmer from rural central Florida, very Republican. That's why he's on the project. Kurt, like me, had never been to a Cuban restaurant. The one ostensibly Cuban food he'd ever eaten was a Cuban sandwich. He ordered the Cuban sandwich. And I told my Cuban-American colleague, like, order me whatever you want. I want to have it. That was his preference. Anyway, all right, last slide here. So, just to get you a little more depressed about our ingrained differences. So these are quotes from a journal article and a relatively recent New York Times article that profiled this research. The short version here, now this is much more recent, so this whole vein of research on how do our brains work, why are we divided, this of course has continued, right? So these very smart people took a sample of our fellow Americans and they typed them politically. They asked them like some opening questions to understand that they had a mixed sample. They had like half liberal, half conservatives. And then they had this group of people, liberal and conservative Americans, watch a set of videos. They all watched the same videos, like 10 short videos about immigration. Why immigration? It's very emotive. Everybody has strong feelings about immigration, however you view the issue. So all these Americans, liberal and conservative, watch the same videos about immigration. As they watch the videos, they're in an MRI, having their brains scanned. And guess what, guys? The liberals and the conservatives in the sample had different parts of their brains light up when watching the same darn videos about immigration. So you see where we're going here. Again, I'm not a neurologist or a political scientist. This is not my area of expertise. But it is very important to understanding what is happening in our country. And I'm not sharing this to depress you. Maybe there'll be a part 2. We'll talk more about what you can do with all this, and there's a lot we can do. But if there was one takeaway that I would ask that you bring from this in your daily lives, the rest of the day, tomorrow, next week, next year, it is not to be depressed. It is to have grace, right? Next time, holidays, Thanksgiving dinner, you're annoying Uncle John, with whom you're always getting into fights because he watches Fox News and you don't. Remember that annoying uncle, like us, like everyone in this room, is at the mercy of forces both external and internal that are way bigger than any of us, right? Okay, so where does this leave us all? This is a quote from another excellent book by Dr. Lily Mason. She's currently at Johns Hopkins. The book is a few years old now, but it really captures this sorting in American life and the ways in which our political identities have subsumed other things. The Republican Party, in large part, has become more monolithically white, conservative and Christian, and the Democratic coalition has become the opposite of that. Increasingly, you will find there's data on liberals and conservatives having different preferences for pets, having different preferences for the size of houses we live in, wanting to live in a more rural or urban area, different preferences for the cars we drive, right? This is deep. Politics has become our identity. But that doesn't explain violence. Here's the thing, guys. Ours is not the only polarized country, right? Countries in Europe that have been polarized longer than us, Spain, politics have been pretty toxic there for a long time. Poland, crazy polarized, right? But our democracy is unique in terms of the rise of violence we have seen since 2016, which begs the question, why is that? Because we're not the only polarized country, but we're the only one to see this rise of violence. And now we're really kind of at the sort of the cutting edge of the research. It's not clear. There are not easy answers to this question, but it's very important to ask. And here are the three things that I see as most salient. First, perceptions of righteousness and threat. So this is a quote from a short working paper by like a dozen political scientists who were trying to come up with a better term than polarization to describe what's happened to us. And the language they come up with is sectarianism. That this is political sectarianism. This is religion of the Old Testament variety. My side is with the Lord, your side is wicked, you must be smited, right? That is how politics feels for many people who are hard partisans. Not most Americans, but the wings right or left. The perception is the other side is dangerous. Okay. Beyond that, in America, particularly for folks who skew more conservative, there is growing evidence that they feel particular status threat. Remember the 2016 election? I'm sure you do. There was a lot of ink spilled around the famous switchers, the people who voted for Obama twice, then they voted for Trump. Why did they do that? A lot of ink spilled on this. There was a discussion about economic factors, right? Is it the economy? Is it the Rust Belt? Is it offshoring to manufacturing to China? Are they all racists? And I think it is fair to say the academic consensus around this came down to this idea of status threat. That at a very basic level, in the history of our country, going back to the colonial period, before there was a United States of America, people who looked white and were, more or less Christian and were dudes have been on top, like forever. And the sense that America is quantifiably less white, also less Christian, is for some folks quite threatening. The point I want to make here is that that is very common. America is not unusual. None of this is unusual. We are in no way unique. So this is a quote from a very dense academic tome by 3 Europeans who were looking at onset of civil war. Oh, you can't see? Okay, that's not good. So this is, well, I'll give you the short version, which is these guys looked at, 120 conflict onset events in a huge data set from like 1946 to 2012 or so. And again, they're trying to marshal all this data. They're looking at the relationship between different ethnic groups in different states, right? There are many countries in the world that are ethnically very, very heterogeneous. Most of them are not in civil wars, right? Like lots of states hold together, even though they're very, very diverse. Lots of people who speak different languages. And yet in some cases, you do see civil wars, right? In some cases, this one group feels they're really getting screwed and all heck breaks loose, right? Why is that? What's going on here? What are the correlates to real violence, to civil war, to insurgencies? And one of the things they find is that when you have a group that is on top and they lose power, or they fear that they might lose power, that is particularly destabilizing. So the quote here, in case you can't read it, the reaction to such traumatic events generates especially intense grievances that increase the risk of conflict outbreak. There's a sense of unfairly lost entitlement and a lust for revenge. Now, the classic example internationally is Iraq in 2003. The United States unseated a minority government. Sunni Arabs had run Iraq for a long time. They were not the majority. We kicked them out of power, and they turned around and formed the backbone of the insurgency fighting the US and also the new Shiite-dominated Iraqi government, right? But go back to the previous slide. 2016 election was the result of anxiety about the dominant group's future status. Given current demographic trends, minority influence will only increase with time, heightening this source of perceived status threat. Okay? So the point I'm trying to make here is that, you know, going back to your Uncle John with whom you may get into arguments at Thanksgiving dinner, these are very common processes. It's normal. It's very normal to be fearful of change, especially if you think, even if it's not accurate, that that change is going to disadvantage you. And remember that in America, we have this deeply ingrained narrative that the pie is fixed. That if they get a bigger slice, I get a smaller slice, right? That's not true. That's definitely not true. Otherwise, our economy would never have grown since 1700, right? But it's deep in our body politic. Heather McGee's book, right? Her whole metaphor of the swimming pool, right after desegregation, especially in the South, but in many American cities, we paved over public swimming pools out of the fear that black people could swim in them, right? Because the pie was fixed. They get some, I lose some. That's not accurate. But that is a narrative that has been pushed in this country since the colonial period. So of course, when the country gets less white, the economy is stagnant for a lot of working class people. We're in these information silos where we sometimes have our worst fears and grievances constantly stoked. Things are messy. Okay, the other thing I want to go back to here, going back to my three at the top, righteousness versus threat. I'm right, they're threatening. Elite rhetoric. Okay, so this is a quote. Can you all read this? How are we doing? Okay. Okay, can't read it, okay. So it says, the normalization of violence by political leaders in particular may provide a sense that acting violently against those groups will be permitted, may not be punished, or could be lauded. Here again, enormous body of research from around the world that suggests that elites set the rules of the game. And when those elites say, hey, those guys are dangerous, they're coming for you, we better fight to defend ourselves from them, you create a permission structure for group violence. Yugoslavia is the classic example. Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb nationalist leader, was a Communist Party hack who, as Yugoslavia was dissolving, deliberately stoked Serb fears and Serb nationalism to justify attempted genocide against non-Serbs, right? He kept saying, the Muslims are coming for you, the Bosniaks are coming for you, the Croats are coming for you. And he justified horrifying violence against them. We have seen examples of the demonization of groups in this country in the last few years. The repeated argument that group X or group Y is somehow threatening, and therefore violence against them is a good thing, right? Okay, last thing we got to talk about here, and this also gets real in the weeds, the quirks of our democratic republic. So there is also a lot of research from comparative political scientists. These are guys who look at different kinds of systems of government and compare them, right? That argues that our system is uniquely prone to instability and maybe violence. Compared to what? Well, okay, imagine there's like a continuum here. Put a British-style parliamentary system of democracy on one end and North Korea on the other end, right? So I'm generalizing a little bit, but very hard authoritarian systems where nobody gets out of line, nobody can say boo, pretty stable. Not great to live in, but pretty stable. At the other end, closer to your ideal democracy where you have mechanisms for coalition government, right? You know, in the UK system as an example, the government in power becomes unpopular, loses their majority, you have a snap election, you get a different representation in parliament. I mean, it is a fairly good one-to-one between where the voter is and the political leaders you get, right? Our system is not North Korea, certainly. It's not anywhere near North Korea. But it does have a number of what political scientists would call minoritarian institutions. So we are this is the second bullet point there, a majoritarian electoral system with strong minoritarian institutions. So in our case, things like the Senate filibuster. One senator can hold up legislation that 85% of Americans want. The Electoral College has become a minoritarian institution. You can be president by not winning the most votes, right? Why is this a problem? Because it's communicating to some Americans, arguably the majority of Americans, that it doesn't matter if you win elections. That maybe this isn't a democracy, right? You can't get the policy outcomes that most Americans want. You can see this on all kinds of issues. Survey Americans, their views on gun control, abortion, a lot of the hot button issues in our discourse, 65% of Americans agree on most of this stuff. The political system makes it very difficult to get to policies that reflect that 65% consensus. And it wasn't always this way, right? This is what's really heightened the danger of the moment we're in. Take the 60s as a comparative case. You had the civil rights movement, huge, mass mobilization against segregation. And then you got the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, right? I mean, the political system ultimately responded. Democracy should be a conflict resolution system. That's what it's there for, right? And we have had cases in the history of our democracy when the system has worked well enough, it was aligned enough with what people wanted, that you saw policy outcomes that people wanted that then resolved conflicts and diffused violence. Imagine for a minute, do a thought experiment. Imagine if you never had the Voting Rights Act passed, Civil Rights Act, right? Like, you would have seen more radicalization. You would have seen more violence, which we saw in the 70s anyway, but it would have been worse, right? Because the democracy wasn't delivering. The democracy did deliver back then, but not anymore. In many cases, right? We've had multiple presidents elected in the last few decades who didn't win the most votes, right? We have arguably 3 people sitting on the Supreme Court who were put there by presidents who didn't win the most votes. Hence having a Supreme Court that is making decisions that are out of step with what most Americans want, right? So, and another one quickly here is single-member districts, right? You have an election for Congress. Of course, most of our seats are so gerrymandered, you don't have much of a contest. But even in the cases that are competitive, the primary process and the fact that it's a winner-take-all election means that you tend to get one or the other candidate that is relatively extreme, again, compared to where a lot of the body politic is. But there's no way to represent through the electoral system, usually, that 65% consensus. So you could have, as an example, a staunchly anti-abortion person elected to Congress in a given district with 49% of the vote. 51% of the vote, right? So that person won by the rules of our system. That's our member of Congress. But you could, I bet you, if you surveyed the voters in that congressional district, most of them would have a kind of consensus position on abortion, as an example, right? But again, the political system doesn't get us to those outcomes. So I'm going to wrap up and we'll have a few minutes for discussion. Now what? What are your takeaways from all this? And again, maybe we'll have a part 2 and I'll give you a whole spiel on what you can do about it, and it will be more uplifting than this conversation, I promise.
Then we have to have it.
Okay. Well, good. I needed to leave you wanting more. You know, I gotta leave the audience excited. Okay, look, the takeaways I would have, again, going back to grace, right? Depending on where you sit, change can be hard, right? If you have historically been in charge in this country and you've been fed for generations this idea that they get a bigger slice, I get a smaller slice, of course this is frightening to you. Doesn't mean it's right. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I get it. Polarization, call it political sectarianism if you want to. All of this that's happening here is big. It's bigger than any of us. And again, that should give us grace for all of us as we try to navigate this. And finally, and this really gets to the work I've been doing for 3.5 years now, this tells me we can change incentives, right? Go back to that point about elite rhetoric, the things that former President Trump has said. Why? Why did he begin to say in the summer of 2020 that he could not legitimately lose the 2020 election? Well, because he calculated correctly that that message would be repeated ad nauseum to a relatively closed group of supporters. Those supporters already were highly mistrustful of institutions. All he did was expand the circle of mistrust into mistrust of election administration, right? So what do we do about that? We change those incentives. We build coalitions, not necessarily in support of a particular candidate or party. We build coalitions of Americans who may disagree on Roe v. Wade or on the Second Amendment, but do agree that if you lose an election, you can have a day in court. If you lose in court also, you have to do the right thing. Shake hands with the other person, acknowledge you lost, don't be a jerk about it. Don't spread misinformation to undermine confidence in the electoral system. Definitely don't incite violence. These are things we all agreed on a handful of years ago. And a lot of the work I'm doing with the Carter Center is organizing Americans around these basic ideas, even if these people otherwise disagree on a lot of stuff. And then the next piece of it, which we're trying to roll out right now, is public messaging. Right? In a state like Michigan, in Wisconsin, lifting up the idea that, hey, go ahead, let's go debate tax policy. That's awesome, that's America, that's great. But if you want to run for a school board seat or a Senate seat, there are these minimum standards that you've got to hold on to. That's what we're trying to do. Okay, so we've got maybe 5-7 minutes for questions, comments?
Yeah, but I won't take the mic around necessarily because we only have 5 minutes. Could you speak up and then could you repeat the question quickly?
Sure, yeah, happy to.
Question?
I've got one.
Yeah.
See, when I was in high school, a million years ago, there was great emphasis put in the political discussion about the wonderfulness of compromise. That's the way things move forward. That has died. And part of that is that we have, we've judged very harshly the 3/5 rule, for example, in the Constitution, which encouraged slavery, gave rewards to the states but now there are folks who would rather have chaos than compromise. That seems like it gets to the heart of some of this problem.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point, and that's embedded in a lot of this, right? The media, the way primaries work, the winner-take-all electoral system, a lot of that does not reward compromise. You get harmed by your own side politically or at the ballot box by compromising, especially when the other side is perceived as, space alien monsters. Yeah, that's a big part of it. Yes?
From a psychologist's point of view, your point, Tom, that the thinking has become less and less flexible. We know that Alfred Adler talked about the problem of rigid thinking and how related that is to a sense of safety. And we know that we are feeling less and less safe.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't have anything to add. I'm sure that's part of this. Yes?
Is it working?
So one of the things that I think is really exciting about your presentation is this notion of how much of the internal stuff that's happening, right? Our brains are wired in certain ways. And I'm not an expert here, and there are probably people in the room who know more about this than I do, but I think that neuroscience is starting to show us that we can change our brains. And I'm curious about whether you have seen, like through certain practices, right? There are folks who are experts in meditation who are going into MRI studies, and we're seeing that expert meditators brains light up in different ways in the MRI than somebody who isn't undergoing that kind of specific targeted practice. Have you seen in your studies and your research and anything looking at this intersection between what neuroscience is showing us is possible in our brains and how we might use that as a strategy for making some change?
That is such a good question. And in part, I don't know the answer, because just to be clear, I am not a researcher. I'm trying to build these networks and get a communication strategy up and running. And so it's a little beyond my expertise. What I will say is, and this is covered in my part 2, if we do a part 2, is you can, I don't know if you can rewire your brain, but you can teach yourself skills to bring into these engagements that will make you more effective, right? So when you're sitting down with your Uncle John and you know he gets you spun up and you get into the same argument once a year, you can definitely prep yourself to not get pulled into that. And it's everything from literally consciously forcing yourself to pause, center yourself. There's a whole bunch of dialogue techniques you can bring to bear. There's ways you can elicit from the other person why they feel the way they do. What in their life experience molded the views they have. So there is a lot you can learn to do if you learn it that can help with this. And maybe you can rewire your brain. Yes?
Oh yeah, just about this conversation. So recently I've been learning about cancel culture, and in the popular mind, cancel culture has been just with famous people, but it's actually something on both sides with everybody, where we just cancel people. We don't, once they say something we don't like, we just shut our brains off. And there are studies, Johanna, about this. So there's a scholar and an organization, his name's Greg Lukianoff, and he just wrote a book with some partners, some psychologists, The Canceling of the American Mind, and it talks about how every day we participate in this, when we just shut somebody up and don't want to listen anymore, or unfriend them because they said something we don't like, instead of talking to them, listening, and then disagreeing, being able to disagree. Like, everything you said today just reminded me of what I've been learning about what cancel culture is. And this book, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, another quick example from my team in Florida. One of the things, I've hired Republicans and Democrats, former state legislators, to recruit Floridians into this bipartisan network. And one of the things they were doing around the midterm elections was when they saw somebody post something on Facebook that wasn't accurate, in this case it was Democrats in Florida, people who lean left, posting questions or criticism of the Florida election results, which really weren't founded, my Democrat on the project would call them. Didn't comment on Facebook, didn't message them on Facebook, she would call them. Hey Bob, listen, I saw that thing you put up. I get it, I get you're frustrated, I'm frustrated too. I'm frustrated that, Ron DeSantis just ran the table in these elections. But there isn't evidence for the thing you just put on Facebook. And when you say stuff like that on Facebook, and you're a prominent, Democratic county commissioner or whatever, that undermines confidence in the democracy. And, they got people to remove Facebook posts, right? So, especially taking the time to actually talk before you, just blast someone or unfriend them is definitely good.
Just talking, and it's so unacceptable to me that Trump, for example, won't debate. That's what we're about. We're about not agreeing and being able to talk in here without being upset and just shutting them up. And he won't even talk, and it's so upsetting to me that all these people think that's okay. That he's not going to debate. He's just not going to. It's so upsetting.
I hear you. It's 11:52. Is that?
Well, what do you think, everybody? Should we have him back again next fall?
Well, thanks, Nathan. We will do a part 2 for sure. I think one thing that comes to my mind is I want the online version, the recorded version, to be seen by my family and neighbors. So I think we could all do that. There's a lot of content here that I learned a lot, and I think we all did. but we want others to hear and tune in. So thanks again. Next week is another great one. We're going to have Laura Calbone, who's a strategic organizing consultant from Fairvote, Minnesota, and her title of her presentation is Ranked Choice Voting, Its Present and Its Future. Thanks again, Nathan. Great.